Well, good day, everybody. This is Chris with The Ancient Scholar. I hope this video finds you all doing well. It's about quitting time here at work. I'm the only one in the office. So what I thought I'd do before I head out is just do a quick video, or maybe not so quick, we'll see. And in this particular video, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about some history, some chemistry, throw in a little bit of microbiology, and just kind of do something a little fun, but hopefully educational. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about antibiotics, specifically the history of antibiotics, which really goes back at least for contemporary antibiotics, as we know them, goes back to the late 1930s, where Alexander Fleming, many people know this story, but just to do a quick little TLDR recap of it, Alexander Fleming coined the term for the first antibiotic, penicillin. And he noticed basically by accident that some of the dishes that he was growing bacteria, he had bacterial cultures in, the bacterial cultures, their growth was inhibited when they had inadvertently become contaminated by a penicillium mold. And he proposed that the mold was producing some sort of chemical or substance, maybe an enzyme, that inhibited bacterial growth. And this was this actually really went back to the late 1920s. This was in 1929, and that's really when he discovered the antimicrobial properties of whatever this substance is that was produced by this mold. The actual chemical structure of penicillin, and I'm going to talk about that, but the basic chemical structure of penicillin was really proposed in the early 1940s. I believe it was Edward Abraham proposed it, 1941, 42, right in there. And then a few years later, it was actually verified using X-ray crystallography. I think it was a woman who actually did the initial X-ray crystallography testing to basically getting a molecule to crystallize into a structure, and then you're able to shoot X-rays at it and kind of recreate the basic chemical structure that way. It's just a fairly common technique for determining the basic chemical structure for substances that are able to you're kind of able to crystallize them in a reproducible pattern. Not all substances are amenable to X-ray crystallography, but many are. I believe it was Dorothy Hodgkin was who kind of spearheaded those original studies. So by the mid-1940s, we've discovered penicillin. We knew a little bit about its chemical structure, and shortly thereafter, it became commercially available as the first of its kind of an agent that has true antimicrobial properties. So it's bactericidal. It's toxic to bacteria, but not so toxic to the human organism, right? So you now have selective toxicity. Because there are lots of things that are antimicrobial, but they have pronounced side effect profiles or specific toxicities that do not make them good agents for being used in the human organism. And this truly completely changed the zeitgeist of managing bacterial infections, because it truly was the first agent that had this specific selective toxicity to it. Now, when I say it is an agent, I'm actually not being completely honest with you all, and that is to say that penicillin really refers to a basic core foundational structure, but then there are lots of individual modifications. So penicillin is not one thing. Penicillin is a group of substances, or a group of molecules that have the same core chemical structure. And so when you say penicillin, it doesn't literally mean penicillin as a singular agent. It really is a broad category of agents. And so with that in mind, the the core chemical structure of penicillins, should we say, really consists of three major things. It consists of the major active site, the site of the bactericidal action, and that is something referred to as the beta-lactam ring. The second component is another ring which provides overall structure and stability to the molecule, and that is the thiazolidine ring. And then there is a side chain, and this side chain can have various components to it. It can be a benzene ring, can be hydroxylated. There are lots of additional side chains that can come off of this core molecule, and these different side chains can change the properties of the parent molecule. Maybe it can make it less likely to be degraded by stomach acid. It can enhance the spectrum, and so on and so forth. So if we look at just the foundational molecular structure of the penicillins, it looks something like this here, if I hold this up for you all to see. This right here, right, so you've got this, so blue is nitrogen, yellow is sulfur, black is carbon, and whites are hydrogens, and I don't have all the hydrogens filled in, just in specific places on this molecule, and then reds are oxygens. So this structure right here with this carbon double bond O and this nitrogen right here, this amine here, is what makes up the reactive component of this molecule, and this is referred to as the beta-lactam ring. All right, so this is the bacterial site. This is the bactericidal component of the penicillin molecule. This ring right here, so you see these two methyl groups, and then you have this ring right here, which contains this sulfur here. And so you know it's going to have a thiol, right? Thiol in its name, and that is the thiazolidine ring right here. And then the beta-lactam ring, and then this carbonyl group right here, so carbon double bond O, and this is where you have additional chemical groups attached to it. This is the R group, or what we call the side chain. But this makes up the core, or the foundation, of the penicillin molecule, with the beta-lactam ring being the primary site of bactericidal action. And penicillins actually belong to a larger category of antibiotics known as the beta-lactams, and that should come as no surprise that they all contain a beta-lactam ring. So another large group of antibiotics that have a similar mechanism of action to the penicillins, but are chemically different, but they do share the beta-lactam ring, or what are known as the cephalosporins. So the penicillins and cephalosporins are both what we call beta-lactam antibiotics, but cephalosporins are not penicillins because they do not have the other core chemical structures that we see in the penicillins. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on the penicillins today, or at least some aspects of the penicillins. So that's penicillin. So this is the basic foundational structure for penicillin. So when we talk about kind of the OG penicillins, going back, you know, the kind of the original penicillins fell into something called penicillin G. And penicillin G is essentially a benzene ring. So let me, I actually have a benzene ring here. So let me do that. So essentially it's this with a benzene ring attached, and there is a CH2 right here in between. So if you have a benzene ring or an aromatic ring with a CH2 coming off as the R group, that is something called penicillin G. And penicillin G again, was one of the original penicillins that was developed, and penicillin G is primarily only administered parenterally because this can be broken down by stomach acid. There is another form of penicillin called penicillin V, where you actually have some additional modifications to this. So you have an oxygen. Let's see if I have an oxygen here. So you actually have an oxygen, and then you have a CH2, and then you even have a methyl group. Let's see if I can add a methyl group to this here. It comes off of that. All right, there we go. So you've got your oxygen, CH2, your methyl group, and then that gets attached as a side chain to the core, the foundational penicillin structure, and that is penicillin V. And penicillin V is resistant to degradation by stomach acid, and so this can be taken orally, whereas penicillin G cannot. All right, so those are kind of like the two OG forms of penicillin, parenteral, intramuscular, versus enteral, the enteral penicillin V, which resists degradation via stomach acid. All right, and these original forms of penicillin were really good at having high rates of bactericidal activity, so they were toxic. When I say an antibiotic is bactericidal, it is directly toxic to the bacteria. It breaks the bacteria down, it kills the bacteria, whereas other antibiotics are what we call bacteriostatic, where they prevent growth, but they may not be directly bactericidal. And then some antibiotics are bacteriostatic at certain concentrations in the body, and then bactericidal at certain concentrations in the body. But to keep it simple, the penicillins tend to be bactericidal, and they work essentially by interacting. So the beta-lactam ring in particular is reactive. It has this oxygen, this nitrogen, makes it reactive, and it actually forms, it chemically binds to proteins that help create or manufacture the cell wall in bacteria. And a very important component of the cell wall in bacteria is something called peptidoglycan. And peptidoglycan is a kind of a modified sugar molecule. So it's a sugar molecule that has peptides in it, basically, peptidoglycan. And this sugar molecule comes together and it cross-links, and it forms kind of this thick, dense component of the bacterial cell wall. And gram-positive bacteria, in particular staph and strep, staphylococcal and streptococcal species, have a very thick cell wall, lots of peptidoglycan. And so those gram-positive bacteria with these thick cell walls contain a lot of peptidoglycan, are particularly susceptible to the beta-lactam antibiotics. Other bacteria, particularly the gram-negative bacteria, tend to have thinner cell walls and tend to have far less peptidoglycan in them, and so the penicillins are not great at covering for lots of gram-negative bacteria, although some modifications have been made to enhance the spectrum of certain penicillin antibiotics, and I'll mention those in a little bit. So essentially what the beta-lactam ring does is it interacts with an enzyme. This is a beta-lactam ring here. It interacts with an enzyme called a protein, rather, a category of proteins we refer to as a penicillin binding proteins, specifically the double D. This is a capital D, so it's DD transpeptidase. I'll just say transpeptidase to keep it simple. And transpeptidase essentially helps take pull the peptides of the peptidoglycan together and cross-link them to form the cell wall, and the beta-lactam ring interacts with the transpeptidase, deactivates it, prevents production of the cell wall then degrades, and the bacteria dies as a result of that. That is the basic mechanism of action. So what happened fairly quickly was, now that you're introducing an antibiotic, that introduces a selection pressure, right? So you're now introducing a selection pressure to the bacteria, and bacteria quickly evolved defenses. They quickly evolved the ability to produce enzymes that interact with these antibiotics and deactivate these antibiotics. All right. So in particular, one of the first things that happened was an enzyme called penicillinase was produced. And penicillinase actually belongs to a category of agents referred to as beta-lactamase. So beta-lactamase is a category, beta-lactamases are is a category of agents that essentially interact with the beta-lactam ring and break it down and prevent it from working. And then once you deactivate the active part of the penicillin, it can no longer function as an antibiotic, and the bacteria is not impacted as substantially by that. And so one of the first things that we started, so one of the first beta-lactamases that we saw that bacteria evolved the ability to produce was penicillinase. And so what happened was we had to go back to the drawing board in a sense and modify the penicillins, and modify them to make them less susceptible to the action of penicillinase. And this is where the so-called semi-synthetic penicillins were produced. So the OG penicillins were kind of the original substances that the fungus made. And now what we're doing is we're taking that and we're chemically modifying it because of the beta-lactamases that are being produced, like penicillinase, right? And this is where you get like oxacillin, nafcillin, and others, these modified semi-synthetic penicillins that were produced later on that were then able to resist the effects of the penicillinase. In addition to that, additional modifications were made, and there was a whole category of penicillins produced called the aminopenicillins. And the aminopenicillins, essentially what happened was an amine group. So, and remember, an amine group is something that comes from ammonia. So ammonia is NH3. It is a nitrogen with 3 hydrogens, and then when you substitute those hydrogens for chemical bonds, you can call it, one hydrogen gets substituted, that's a primary amine, secondary and tertiary amine, right? And so you add an amine group to the side chain, that R chain in the penicillin, and that produces something called an aminopenicillin. So these included things like amoxicillin and ampicillin, and these are some of the newer modified penicillins. Amoxicillin can be taken orally, whereas ampicillin can only be taken parenterally. So ampicillin has to be given typically intravenously or possibly intramuscular, whereas amoxicillin can be given through the oral route. So if we look at the chemical structure of the aminopenicillins versus the penicillins, and I'll kind of demonstrate that for you all here. Let's take a look at amoxicillin first of all. So amoxicillin essentially is very similar to the Pen-V and Pen-G in that you're going to have a benzene ring. It's just some of the, obviously you're also going to have an amine in there. So let's just take a look at amoxicillin. So amoxicillin, you're going to have a hydroxyl group that comes off of the benzene ring. So let me go ahead and put that in. So you're going to have an alcohol group or a hydroxyl group coming off of the benzene ring. And then you're going to have your CH2 in the middle. And then you're going to have an NH2 coming off of that CH2. All right, so there's your NH2. So there's the amine group. And then you've got your core penicillin molecule, and then this is going to be attached as that side chain or that R chain, like so, right? And so this is what makes it an aminopenicillin. And then you've got the benzene ring and the hydroxyl group. And so here you have amoxicillin. Ampicillin is very similar. And essentially, ampicillin is amoxicillin without the hydroxyl group. So with just the benzene ring, and that's ampicillin there. So very subtle changes in functional groups can have very large changes to the overall behavior of a molecule. All right. And again, these semisynthetics and these aminopenicillins had essentially the same kind of activity against primarily gram-positive organisms, but something very interesting happened with the aminopenicillins, that amine group in the R group, the R chain, and that is the spectrum was actually enhanced. So the aminopenicillins have enhanced gram-negative coverage as opposed to mainly gram-positive with Pen-G, Pen-V, the semisynthetics, right? So you actually enhance the spectrum of the penicillin by making it an aminopenicillin. And then additional resistance happened, and additional beta-lactamases were produced by bacteria as they, again, you're introducing more selection pressures, and the bacteria begin evolving the ability to create more and more of these beta-lactamases. And so kind of more recently, if you will, what we've had to do is we've actually had to take something like amoxicillin and then combine it with another molecule that kind of acts like a protective shield, if you will, to protect the antibiotic from degradation by these other beta-lactamases. And that's where you have things like a clavulinate and sulbactam, which are not they don't really have antibacterial activity in and of themselves, but what you do is you add them to the penicillin to protect the penicillin from being degraded by the beta-lactamases that are produced. And so if you take penicillin and you combine it with clavulanic acid or clavulinate, you get an antibiotic called augmentin, right? So augmentin is able to overcome some of these other beta-lactamases that are produced by bacteria. If you take penicillin and you combine it with sulbactam, you get something called ampicillin, all right, which I believe is also something I mentioned in the aminopenicillins. So you also have with these enhanced penicillins, if you will, you do have gram-positive and gram-negative coverage, as well as anaerobic coverage in some cases, but you also have the ability to overcome some of the antimicrobial resistance that has formed. And then later on, we were even able to do some other additional modifications, and we were able to develop penicillins that had enhanced activities against Pseudomonas, and we call those the anti-pseudomonal penicillins. So that's kind of the history and the molecular structure and the basic mechanism of action of penicillins in a nutshell. If you all liked this video, I might consider doing additional videos on cephalosporins and then maybe some of these other antibiotics that have very different mechanisms of action. Maybe they target protein synthesis, for example, and the macrolides and things like that. But we'll just see how this video does and how it resonates with people. All right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time around. Take care. Bye-bye.